Esther is one of the best written short stories in all of Hebrew literature, not just the Bible, in all of Hebrew literature. It is so well written that a lot of people think it's fiction. It's just too good to be true. I mean, you've got a queen who refuses to make a command appearance before the king, so he commands her to never appear before him again. And then you've got divorce, Persian style. And then you've got a beautiful Jewish maiden who becomes queen and puts her life on the line and saves her people from a Holocaust, even though most of that time the king and the other Persian people did not know she was Jewish. And you've got a deliciously evil villain, Haman, a high Persian official who seethes with vengeance when a lowly worker, Mordecai, refuses to bow before him. So he plots to kill Mordecai and builds a 75-foot gallows that he's planning for Mordecai to die on, and he winds up honoring Mordecai instead at the command of the king, and then hanging on the gallows himself that he built for Mordecai. You've even got happy ending there, you know. And behind this powerful story churns up a full platter of emotions from glee to fear, running throughout the entire story. It is such a beautifully written and beautifully explained story. Esther became queen in 479 BC, and the book was written sometime after that, between 475 and 471 BC. Have you ever heard the phrase or the expression, a fish out of water? It's a phrase that is used to describe people outside their natural habitat. They're a fish out of water. Who's a fish out of water? Well, a truck driver at a poetry recital would be a good example of that. A vegetarian at a barbecue. That is a fish out of water. An anti-gun activist at a turkey shoot. That is a fish out of water. Sean McAfee at a convention of tall men. That is a fish. All right, well, I'll be fair. Randy Simmons at a convention of thin men. I mean, these are all fish out of water. Here's another example. The Jewish community in Persia, away from their homeland. In 535 BC, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians after 50 years before that, conquering Judah and carrying the Jews in captivity back to Babylon. They then fell themselves to the Persians. And King Cyrus issued an edict allowing the Jews to return to Judah to build their homeland and to rebuild the holy city, the Jerusalem of God. Judah and Samaria, the land that God chose for his people. They could go back home. And it's where the Jews belong. But get this, an overwhelming majority of them refused to go. And they stayed in Persia. While in exile, many of the Jews had prospered. They had risen to prominent positions in Persia. They had built businesses and homes and had families. And in fact, Isaiah 6:13 implies that 90% of the Jews stayed in Persia. And that even over the 3 waves that we talked about last week of Jews returning, only about 10% returned. And these Jews became known as the diaspora. You still hear the word today. Often today, the word is still used, the diaspora or the dispersion. Those were Jews who were fish out of water. They belonged in Judah, but lived in a foreign land under Gentile rulers, surrounded completely by a pagan culture, but had gotten comfortable with it and had come to compromise their faith there. And yet, God so wants to keep his promise to his people that he is going to remain faithful to them. His providence supernaturally protected these displaced Jews and ensured their survival. And the book of Esther is a monument to God's providence. What is providence? It's a big word. We don't use it a lot. Simply this: providence is God's overarching invention in the affairs of man. It means he is accomplishing his purposes with or without man's cooperation. And so that's the way the great book of Esther begins. And once upon a time might have been the best way to start this story, because it does indeed read a little bit like a fairy tale. The time frame is covered in the book of Ezra. I think it was last week that we covered the book of Ezra, and the time frame that Esther takes place is between chapter 6 and 7 in the book of Ezra. So, toward the end of his week-long drunk fest, when the king was in high spirits from wine, King Xerxes ordered his wife, the queen, to parade before his male guest these 7 eunuchs who attended him and give a show. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. Now, we can all read through the lines of what is being said there. Apparently, he is wanting some sort of a coochie show. How do you say that? What would be the best way to say that? Some sort of back alley stage show. If you've got a better way to say it, you say it. And the queen apparently has no desire to join the king for show and tell, and doesn't want to be remembered just for being another piece of beautiful property. So she boldly refuses to go. And this made the king furious, and he burned with anger when the queen refused to appear before him and his drunken guests. His kingly ego is offended by this public embarrassment of him, and so he seeks the wise men's advice around him on how to handle this slight coming from the queen. What must be done to Queen Vashti, the king said? What penalty for a queen who refuses to obey the king? And Memucan answered the king and his nobles and said, she has wronged not only the king, but every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, now this is probably a little overblown, right? But before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the king did and will start treating their husbands the same way. And there will be no end to their contempt and anger. So if it please the king, we suggest you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked, that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. Fearing a women's liberation and women's rights movement that would spread throughout the whole land, they kicked the queen out of the palace. We get a little divorce Persian style. She can never even come into the presence of the king again. And on top of that, they're going to start a little beauty contest for her successor. So these men interpret Vashti's refusal as a potential widespread uprising, a first strike for women's rights that might affect them. Did you notice what they said? Hey, I might go home and my wife might not do what I say. It might have started to affect them, so they feel like they have got to make an example out of Queen Vashti. And they do. But to her credit, although she exits the story at this point, Vashti retains her integrity and her dignity. She has to forfeit her privileges, but she keeps her virtues, she keeps her dignity, she keeps her value. Virtue always comes with a price tag. It's costly. That's why it's so valuable. Anybody can cave in and go along with the crowd, and in her case, have lowered her standards and her dignity to that of a slut status. It takes courage and values to become a person of honor. So, she hears of words, "You're fired," and Xerxes' advisors recommend a search for a new queen. Let us search the empire to find beautiful virgins for the queen. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. In other words, the first bachelor is about to break out. And it's going to be a number of the most beautiful women in the kingdom showing themselves for the king, Xerxes. And they're all going to be given beauty treatments. And the one who pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. And the advice was very appealing to the king. I bet it was. So he put the plan into effect. And seriously, here we are off with the first bachelor in the first few verses of chapter 2. In verse 5, we are introduced to a key man in the story, a Jewish man named Mordecai. Now, if you don't stay with me the rest of the time, stay with me the next 2.5 minutes, because you need to understand who Mordecai was, what his connection was to Haman, why Haman hated him so much, and why almost all the things that are going to happen. So a little historical tidbit. The Benjamites, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, were the tribe that King Saul was from, the first king of Israel. And it was Saul who defeated the Amalekites under the leadership of King Agag. And the story is in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And King Agag of the Amalekites was humiliated, totally defeated. Agag was the great-great-great-grandfather of Haman, this evil prime minister in Persia, and the enemy of Mordecai. We'll meet Haman in the next chapter. So, Mordecai had raised his cousin, Esther, who it turns out was going to be a candidate for the new queen because the king's men did not know she was Jewish. The man had a very beautiful and lovely cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. Hadassah was her Persian name. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many of the other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Hagai's care. Hagai was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly and ordered a special menu for her and beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids and specially chosen from the king's palace. He moved her into the best place in the harem. She is on her way to a good result, it looks like, in The Bachelor. And indeed she was. The king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set his royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. And Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret because her uncle Mordecai had told her to do so. All of these details are going to matter a lot in the coming chapter. Now, in chapter 3, we are introduced to Haman the horrific. He must have had some pretty incredible credentials because the king had raised him to the highest place in his empire other than the king himself, second only to the king. But again, as I reminded you a moment ago, Haman is an Agagite, a descendant of the king that was destroyed by Saul in 1 Samuel 15. And he sees this situation as an opportunity to use his power and use his revenge to destroy all the Jews in the region. You see, he not only hates Mordecai, being a relative of King Saul, but he hates all the Jews. And when he saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to just lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said to him, "There's a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people. They refuse to obey the laws of the king. It is not in the king's best interest to let these people live. So if it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." So dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all the Jews, young and old, women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. And that single day was scheduled to happen on March the 7th of the next year. And to really, really put the bounty on their heads, the property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. What? Open season on killing the Jews and taking their property and their home? That's why we call him horrible or horrific Haman. By the way, he has a counterpart in history, doesn't he? Anybody remember anybody else whose name started with an H that tried to present did present a Holocaust against the Jewish people? Yep. You know, this is a time where we should just pull over and park for just a minute and ask the question, why? Why all this that lasts to this day, to this very moment? Why all this anti-Semitism? Why all this horrible hatred and oppression and even murder of the Jews? Well, I think the primary answer is God's providential blessing on the Jews produces an envy and a spite in the non-Jews. The fact that God came out from the very beginning and said, "This is going to be my chosen people, and the Messiah is going to come through their line," that sort of produces a natural envy and spite against the Jews. Mark Twain, who was Jewish, once called anti-Semitism the swollen envy of pygmy minds. Now think about that for a second. The swollen envy of pygmy minds. But it's more than that. Hatred for the Jews is not an ordinary, run-of-the-mill form of prejudice. The Bible suggests that Satan is actually the source of anti-Semitism, because if Satan can't harm God directly, he will try to harm God's chosen people directly. And he will do it over and over and over again. What else can explain the relentless brutality against the Jewish people unlike any other people in all of history? From the Romans to the Crusades to the pogroms in Russia to Hitler's Holocaust, the only explanation for history's relentless onslaught against the Jews is satanic involvement. And the survival of the Jews throughout all of that, when so many other peoples facing far less have exited the world, is an amazing example and a direct result of God's providence. So you remember Haman's name and nature by associating Haman and Hitler. The two go together phonetically and philosophically. The two go together. They both killed the Jews. Hitler killed somewhere between 4 and 6 million of the Jews. And Haman would have killed several million himself if it weren't for what is about to happen. That's what makes the story so beautiful. Esther's very happy life and life of ease was about to come crashing down. When Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city crying with a loud and bitter wail. Can you picture this? Man is just walking out through the city, Jewish man in the capital of Persia, walking out through the city in burlap and ashes, which was the way Jews showed their mourning, crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace because he couldn't go any further than that. That's as far as he could go. No one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among all the Jews. They fasted, they wept, they wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. Anytime your world is crashing in, it is entirely natural and appropriate to have an emotional response. Sackcloth and ashes always represented, for the Jews, a sense of hopelessness that grew out of heartfelt mourning. So the queen, now Esther, is in great distress, even though she is not yet aware of the decree. Once she learns of the decree, she is faced with an enormous dilemma. Does she reveal her Jewish heritage to the king? Does she violate the law of approaching the king in his inner court, which was against Persian law? All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces, she said, know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die, unless the king holds out his gold scepter as you enter. And the king has not called for me to come to him in 30 days. The clock is ticking. He hasn't called for her in 30 days. She can't go in on her own. It's under the threat of death for her to do so. Now, before we get into the 4 unbelievable verses that many of us know that make up this book, it's important to tuck in a little very important information right here. What is utterly amazing about the story of Esther is God's faithfulness to Esther and to Mordecai despite their unfaithfulness. Stay with me a minute. Throughout the book, our hero and our heroine are guilty of numerous violations of God's law. The most obvious was Esther's willingness to marry a pagan. Xerxes worshiped the god Zoroaster. So she did too. And then as we move through the whole story, reading the verses that we're bypassing here, we also find that Esther fails to keep the Jewish dietary laws. She does not keep the Sabbath day holy. She doesn't practice the feast days. She felt none of the moral conflicts with the pagan practices that upset Daniel in Babylon and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon. She is really not practicing Judaism at all. She's been quick to compromise any belief that she has. Rather than be a witness for God, she has been covering up her nationality and her godly heritage. In fact, it's interesting, and I'm sure some of you wondered if I would bring this out this morning, that Esther is the only book in the entire Bible where what? The name of God is not used. The entire book. The name of God is not mentioned one time. Yet, that's not a big surprise because that sort of sums up the lives of Esther and Mordecai and many of the diaspora Jews, the 90% that had stayed behind at that time. They were Jewish, but their Jewishness was more ethnic and racial than it was religious and practical. And by the way, that describes most Jews today. Most Jews today are not what we would call traditional Orthodox Jews. They're not. Most of them hold to their Jewishness with a patriotic fervor without trying to keep Old Testament law or really even keep a belief in God. I have a very close Jewish friend. I went to his son's bar mitzvah, and he told me, he said probably at least 30 to 40% of Jews don't even believe in God at all currently. So, here's what I want you to understand as the background before we read these next 4 unbelievably powerful verses. This is where we are. So Esther, having said, I don't know what I can do. I can't go in. If I go in, I'm under the threat of death. Mordecai sends a reply to Esther immediately. Very next verse. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? There's the challenge. Here is going to come Esther's response to the challenge. Think about the pressure Esther's under. Think about the pressure she's under right now. Every direction she turns, she's under pressure. To her uncle who raised her, took her in when she was an orphan, Mordecai. To her people, but to the king, to her lifestyle. She is being under siege from every direction of her life, which makes her reply all the more wonderful. Esther replied to Mordecai, "Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, nights or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die." The old King James Version that many of us memorized said, of course, "If I perish, I perish." here's what's fascinating. At first, she wanted to keep her head in the sand. She didn't want to reveal her identity. She wanted it to just all go away. Isn't that often our response when we're faced with something just so difficult to decide on? I wish I didn't have to decide. I don't want to decide. If I just stick my head in the sand, maybe it'll all go away. But no, it was just getting worse and worse. So at first she wanted to stick her head in the sand, and at last she's willing to lay it on the line, agreeing to risk it all and step up for her nation and for her people. In chapter 5, we are introduced to what will happen after that decision. I want you to understand this isn't Esther's job on the line. This isn't her popularity on the line. This isn't the boy she wants to date on the line or the impression she wants to make on a customer on the line. This is her very life on the line. And she already knows what just happened to Vashti. Yet she's willing to give it up. That, my friends, should mimic our devotion to the Lord Jesus. Mordecai has no doubts that deliverance will come for the Jewish people. I gloated over it intentionally so I could come back to it right now. Even though, again, Mordecai has not been a faithful, observant Jew, notice what he said before he said, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for a time as this." If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. We'll lose this battle in the war, and we'll all die, but we won't lose the war, because deliverance and relief for the Jews will come from some other place. That's amazing. Mordecai knows and understands that God has made a covenant with his people, and there are promises given to Abraham that must be fulfilled. Now, there's some mystery as to how those rescues will take place through the course of human events and time and society, but it will eventually happen. And so, Esther risked death in entering the inner court of the king. And she's ready for the consequences of her decision. So on the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. And the king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. And when he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter. That, you remember, was the sign that you could enter. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. And Esther eventually says to him while they are there together, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, King, would you please come with Haman tomorrow to a banquet I will prepare for you? And then I will explain what this is all about." So they invited Haman, and Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. Don't read the rest of it, because I want to talk a little bit about what happens in between here. If you know the story, Esther is going to have 2 banquets on 2 consecutive days. This is the end of the first banquet at the palace. There are only going to be 3 people there: Xerxes, Esther, and Haman at both of the banquets. Now you say, why have 2 banquets? That's the first question I had. And I think Esther's angle here might have had several elements. Perhaps she wanted to throw Haman off guard. And if so, she did. She did. He was a very happy man as he left the banquet. If by any chance he had any suspicion of what she might be up to, So she's being very clever and very careful. And knowing that kings delight in partying and particularly drinking, why not put him in the best possible mood for hearing 2 days and nights of drinking for maybe granting her request? You know, there are happy drunks, there are sad drunks, there are mad drunks. The impression given here is she had a happy drunk for a husband. Get him in a better mood. Why not throw 2 banquets on consecutive days to buy a little time and let Haman be lulled into a growing confidence in his own plans? Let Haman's ego get the best of him, which is exactly what happens. He was a happy man as he left the banquet. And then, and this is what envy and anger does to every single one of us. You ever been happy like this? And you're just peachy keen. You got life under control. And then you see something or hear something or do something that makes you upset or angry, and just like that, the switch flips. That's what happened here. And it happened because he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up to honor him as the second most powerful Persian, not trembling nervously before him. And Haman became furious. He had to restrain himself, and he went home, and he gathered his friends and his wife. And he boasted to them about the great banquet that he had just spent in the presence of just the king and the queen, and the honor that had been given him, and how he had been promoted over all the others. And then he said, and that's not all. Esther invited only me and the king, and she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. Wow. She's got him right where she wants him. Now, Esther's plan is to trust God and let evil hang itself. 2 very significant things happen between the first banquet and the second banquet. Haman is so mad at Mordecai, he has a gallows built. Chapter 5, verse 14 says. And the king has a very sleepless night. And so he has a history of the kingdom brought to him so it could be read to him. And in the history of he had forgotten an account about how Mordecai had exposed a plot to kill him. And he says, what reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? And his attendant said, nothing's ever been done to him. And he said, who is that in the outer court? I'm sure hoping it was Mordecai to reward him. And as it happened, Haman was coming to tell him about killing Mordecai on the gallows, to ask the king to impale him. So the attendant said, well, it's Haman out in the court. And he said, well, bring him in. And the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thinks he's talking about him. Haman thinks he's coming to the second banquet. He's going to get Mordecai killed. And what else can the king do to honor him? So he thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? And he replied, well, Mr. King, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. And let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes, and be led through the city square on the king's horse, and have the official that's leading him shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. And the king said, excellent, quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. And the king said, leave out nothing you have suggested. So Haman took the robes, put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, led him through the city square, shouting, This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Isn't that delicious? Utterly delicious. A classic case of what happens when ego runs amok. And Haman went home discouraged, and before he can finish even telling his family and friends who had suggested to him building the gallows, the king's eunuchs arrived and took him to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Now they're in the second banquet, and the king says, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it is up to half the kingdom." The incredible irony here is that Haman is about to end up hanging on the gallows he had built for Mordecai. What was to bring Haman incredible joy, the gallows with Mordecai on it, became the instrument of his own judgment. How quickly God turned the tables on the Jews. And this, by the way, has been the case throughout their history. God told Abraham he would bless the nations that bless Israel and curse the nations that curse them. Interestingly, even though Hitler killed somewhere between 4 and 6 million Jews, God turned the table on Hitler's intentions. It was the Holocaust that finally softened world opinion against the Jews and convinced the United Nations of the need for a Jewish homeland where they would be safe. So Hitler, the man who wanted to utterly annihilate the Jews, was the primary cause in the formation of the modern state of Israel. What a strange twist. As Germany crumbled, Israel was reborn. In the book of Esther, what a strange twist. As the second most powerful in Persia was hung on the gallows that he had prepared for the Jew, all of the Jews were rescued from a Holocaust because of the faith and the courage of one young Jewish woman who was willing to say, "If I perish, I perish." The stories parallel so incredibly well. So what happened, and we're running out of time, is the king did allow a decree that Jews in every city could defend themselves. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality who might attack them and take their property. They were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. They did that. The Jews at Susa killed their enemies on that same date that had been prepared for them, March 7th, and again on the 8th. And then on the 9th, they made that a day of feasting and gladness. And so the last verse there says, "So to this day, rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate an annual festival and holiday on the appointed day in late winter when they rejoice and send gifts of food to each other." Some of you may have heard about this day because to this very day they still celebrate this day. It's called the Feast of Purim. It is probably outside of maybe 2 other days, maybe Hanukkah and maybe the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, their third most valuable holiday. They exchange gifts like we do at Christmas on the Feast of Purim. The children dress, the children all dress in the clothes of the people of Esther's day. And it's a big deal which child gets to be Esther and which child gets to be Mordecai. And they play games and they have parties and they have a feast. And to this day, every year, the Jews celebrate what happened in the book of Esther on the Feast of Purim. Fabulous.